Individual awards in professional sports have always represented a way to recognize the players that perform the best in certain areas every year, being something that only takes into account that one season. For example, the MVP award goes to the best player that regular season and that regular season only, not taking anything from the past or anything they do in the playoffs into account. With the decade coming to a close, what I figured would be something interesting to do is take a look at the last 10 years as a whole and hold an awards ceremony for the players who deserve each award for the totality of what they've accomplished in the decade. This is a way to reward consistent greatness over a longer period of time as opposed to 1 year at a time. We'll be handing out the MVP, Defensive Player of the Decade, Most Improved Player of the Decade, Sixth Man of the Decade, Best Rookie of the Decade, and Coach of the Decade. Before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. The first award we'll be handing out is the biggest one, being the MVP of the decade, and I don't think the winner here is going to surprise many people. The MVP of the decade is LeBron James, with this decade being the years where he went from being an unbelievable talent with worlds of potential to being a champion that has honed his craft seemingly every single year. He's won the MVP award 3 times this decade, being in 2010, 2012, and 2013, was the runner-up for the award twice, and was top 5 in voting in 9 of the 10 years. His greatness has been consistent, it's been dominant, and every year he seems to be more polished in an area that he previously wasn't. The beginning of the decade was when he was in the prime of his athletic form, being arguably the most athletic player to ever play the game in that span, and then starting in the middle of the decade and continuing even now, his skills are so refined to the point where he's running point forward this season, leading the NBA in assists, while also being one of the most efficient players out of the post. He led his team to the NBA Finals a ridiculous 8 straight seasons this decade, won the Finals 3 times while earning the Finals MVP award for each of those 3 Finals victories, and for the decade, he statistically averaged 26.8 points, 7.8 assists, 7.7 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game, while shooting 52.6% from the field and 35.3% from 3. Some of the other players that were in the running were Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, James Harden, and Kawhi Leonard, all of which have been phenomenal this decade and have proven their greatness in their own individual ways, but ultimately they were competing with one of the best players to ever play the game, so unfortunately they're only honorable mentions. The next award we'll be handing out is the Defensive Player of the Decade, going to the player that has played the best defense for the decade as a whole, and the winner here is Kawhi Leonard. This definitely was one of the most difficult awards to decide because there were a few candidates that were absolutely neck and neck, but ultimately I feel like Leonard's ability to lock a player up is something very few in the history of the game have been able to replicate. He really burst onto the scene as a top-tier defender in the 2014 NBA Finals, showing as a young player that no stage was too big for him and no opponent was too tough for him to handle. This series, he won the Finals MVP award almost solely because of his ability to pester LeBron James and make everything he did as tough as possible. He then won the Defensive Player of the Year award in the next 2 seasons, in 2015 and 2016, establishing himself as the best perimeter defender in the game. After that, his offensive game really started to improve to the point where he became a legitimate two-way superstar, and even though his offensive workload increased, he still maintained all-defense caliber play. He's been named first-team all-defense 3 times and second-team all-defense twice, spending half the decade on these lists, despite getting his start in just 2012. One player that gave him a real run for his money was Draymond Green, who anchored the Warriors dynasty and became one of the most dynamic defensive players in the NBA. As an undersized big man, his combination of strength and mobility made it so he could protect the rim surprisingly well and do damage out on the perimeter. Another player in the running was Dwight Howard, whose reign as the defensive monster was arguably the highest peak at the beginning of this decade, but the injury bug struck and his run as an elite defender this decade didn't quite last as long as others for him to win the award. Other honorable mentions here include Rudy Gobert and Chris Paul, both of which were tremendous defenders in their own right. The next award we'll be handing out is the Most Improved Player of the Decade, being the player who, instead of improving the most from one year to another, improved the most over the decade's entirety, and the winner is Giannis Antetokounmpo. When Giannis first came into the league, he was as big of a project as it gets in the NBA, and I don't think there's a single person on the planet who could have foreseen what he's developed into. When he was drafted back in 2013, he was all skin and bones with freakishly long arms and little to no skill. When he started out, he was just a bundle of length and athleticism that he used to run up and down the floor and make plays on defense or at the rim, but his offensive game was in desperate need of some polish. He averaged 6.8 points per game as a rookie while shooting 41% from the field. And then, as crazy as it sounds, every single season he's managed to improve his scoring average from the previous year. Fast forward to now to the present, and he's gone from that skinny guy to one of the strongest forwards in the league. His ball handling ability has become one of his greatest assets as he gets to the rim and finishes strongly regularly, and he's now averaging 29.6 points per game, shooting 55% from the field. He's an MVP winner, and in all likelihood will go back-to-back this season whenever play resumes. He's one of the most versatile defensive players in the league, and he's leading the Bucks to the top of the Eastern Conference. No player has improved as much as he has, so he easily takes home this award here. One player that was definitely in the running that I was considering actually was Kawhi Leonard, who we just discussed, because when he came into the league, he wasn't exactly dominating out of the gate either, averaging just 18 points per game as a rookie, but ultimately, while he has improved a ton for sure, I feel like Giannis's jump was bigger. The next award we'll be handing out is the Best Rookie of the Decade, and unfortunately this is the only one where the entirety of the decade doesn't exactly apply for the players' careers. Because it is an award based solely on rookies, I'll be giving it to the player who I believe had the best rookie season of the decade, and my choice here is Blake Griffin, who won the Rookie of the Year award back in 2011. Griffin's debut was highly anticipated because he suffered an injury in preseason that caused him to miss the entire 2010 season, but when he was finally able to return to the court, he put on a show, instantly wowing fans with unbelievable poster dunks and powerful finishes at the basket. Before the injury started to take a toll on his play in later years, he was one of the best athletes in the league, and for a power forward, his dunking ability was arguably Vince Carter-esque. Not only that though, but as a rookie, he averaged an insane 22.5 points and 12.5 rebounds per game, and while the power he possessed usually got all the attention on SportsCenter, his finesse was incredibly underrated. He could handle the ball incredibly well for a big man, he was a very good passer for a big man, and his all-around play was as good as any rookie's has ever been. Some honorable mentions for this award are Tyreke Evans, Ben Simmons, Karl Anthony Towns, and Luka Doncic, all of which had exceptional rookie years, but ultimately I think Blake's tops them all. The next award we'll be handing out is the Sixth Man of the Decade, being the best bench player over the course of the last 10 years, and the winner here is Lou Williams. Williams has everything a team could possibly want from a bench player, starting in Philadelphia, then going to Atlanta, then Toronto, then the Lakers, then Houston, and then the Clippers where he's been at the last 3 seasons. He's won the award 3 times this decade, which is the most in that span, and as he's aged, he's only gotten better and better. His ability to create offense off the dribble and score the ball has been amongst the best bench players over his entire career, seemingly always being in the running for the award even when he doesn't win it. He won the award in 2015, 2018, and 2019, with the last 2 being dominant displays off the bench. On the Clippers, he's averaged over 20 points per game in the last 3 years, which is something very few bench players accomplish. The only other player to give Lou a run for his money in this category was Jamal Crawford, who won the award twice this decade, and had it not been for Williams' strong finish to the decade, he very well might have been the favorite, but Williams going back-to-back these last 2 years, putting up great numbers like he has, gives him the slightest of edges in my opinion. And finally, the last award we'll be handing out is the Coach of the Decade award, and the winner here was another relatively easy decision, being Greg Popovich. No other coach has led their team to the playoffs every single season this decade, and Popovich did so in the midst of a ton of roster turnover and aging veterans. The beginning to middle of the decade saw the end of the Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili dynasty, capped off with a dominant NBA Finals run in 2014. Then after that, those players began to age, and the development of Kawhi Leonard played a big part in them remaining competitive, and all the while, Popovich proved he could get the most out of role players that maybe hadn't shown as much in other systems. The Spurs' greatness as a franchise begins with Popovich and works its way down, which is why he beat out the other coaches who may have won more but with more talented rosters. Steve Kerr is a close runner-up here for being at the helm of the Warriors dynasty, but that team was so unbelievably talented, especially after Kevin Durant joined, that I don't necessarily think his coaching is what pushed them over the edge. Ultimately, the best coaching performances have consistently come from the greatest coach of all time, being Greg Popovich. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below your winners for each of these awards. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.